The woman in the designer suit froze mid-step as the man slid into her seat with a smug grin. "Sorry, sweetheart," he said, fastening his belt. "You must be mistaken." Her gold boarding pass trembled in her manicured hand. Every eye in the cabin turned toward her, curiosity sharpening like knives. The flight attendant hesitated, too long, too cold, before taking a side, and in that fragile silence before takeoff, something inside her snapped. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find the story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The hum of the jet pressed against Grace Mitchell like a low, steady heartbeat. She sat by the window, fingers tracing the seam of the leather armrest as if feeling its stitches could stitch something in her own life back together. Outside, the airport lights poured past in long, blurred beads, gold, white, a smear of tired blue, and the plane rolled forward, gathering speed and purpose. Inside, everything smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel, of papers that had been folded and unfolded a dozen times. It was a small, private world suspended between departures and arrivals, and Grace felt it like a pause before a deep breath. Her eyes were tired, but not empty. They held a kind of careful fire, the look of someone who had learned to measure risk the way other people measure time. At 29, she had already built a company people used without thinking, an app that threaded convenience through the cracks of daily life and turned its founder into a name that belonged on club lists and charity invitations. With millions in the bank and a life photographed in glossy frames, she carried something heavier than money. There was a private ledger of losses and decisions, of people she'd trusted and moves she'd made to survive. That ledger lived in the small crease between her eyebrows. Grace fitted the world into scheduled windows. A morning call, a boardroom, a gala. She had trained herself to accept empty pleasantries with the calm of practice. Yet tonight there was something raw where the polished surface usually was. She had flown this route before, but never with the same weight lodged under her ribs. A letter, folded thin and hollowing her like wind through a hollow bone, sat in the pocket of her handbag. She had read it twice, 3 times, until the ink began to blur and the words felt both close and impossible to touch. It had arrived with no return address, only a signature she did not recognize and a single sentence that made the room tilt. "We know what you did at the Meridian." Grace's jaw tightened. Her fingers tightened on the armrest. She was precise by training and temperament. Secrets were risks to be managed. Yet the letter had unsettled her in a way that contracts never did. Maybe it was the accusation that mentioned people she thought had been buried, old partnerships, old promises that had been rewritten under pressure. Or maybe it was that someone, somewhere had the power to unravel the tidy threads of her life with a single page. The cabin lights dimmed a notch as the flight attendant slid past in a soft uniform, the practice smile folding into place. A baby began to wail 3 rows back, a sound that cut into Grace's thoughts like a dull edge, drawing her back to the present. She watched people in her row, a man with a thick briefcase and a face like wet stone, a young couple sharing headphones and a laugh that belonged in another world. She felt both separate and at the center, like a sealed room full of light. She thought of her mother, of late nights in a small kitchen tasting the aroma of boiled greens and cheap rice. How easily memory shrinks the past, turning cramped apartments into cozy stories and scraped years into lessons. Grace had promised herself one thing each time she stepped into a new building, took a phone call, signed a new line on a ledger. Never again desperate, never again powerless. Money had become a shield and a hammer both. She used it to wed old debts and to break new doors. In the beginning, that hunger had been simple survival. But power settles like a coat, and before long it changes the way you move through rooms. Her phone buzzed, a tiny, polite tremor that cut through the hum. It was her assistant, flight delayed, ground hold in effect. She glanced at the window. Outside, the world still rolled, taxis, trucks, a distant tower blinking red. The pilot's calm voice came over the speakers, apologizing for an unexpected hold, but promising they would be underway shortly. Grace's stomach tightened. She liked to be on time for things, meetings, appearances, the rituals that secured her image. Delay meant another variable to control. Across the aisle, a man whose skin was pale as a winter window board lifted his head and smiled at her in a way that assumed both permission and familiarity. He was mid-40s, his hair combed back with the same care he used to fold his napkin. He had the sort of face that expected deference and got it. He tapped the edge of his seat with an easy certainty, as if the world's spaces had been carved to suit him. Grace felt the heat of recognition, a small, sour taste of being seen and sized. Sometimes, even with everything, she felt under inspection, as if people measured her wealth and assumed it explained her. Her seat was wide, first class, but tonight it felt like a stage. She adjusted her silk scarf and thought about the letter again. She had enemies, of course, old rivals who resented what she had built, board members who had lost money on her bets. But this felt personal. The signature at the bottom of the letter had been a single initial, a mark like the curl of a question, and her mind supplied names until it spun dizzy. Who would risk this? Who wanted to make her step into daylight with no safety net? There was a sound like a small, contained storm as two attendants ushered a passenger down the aisle, a woman with hair the color of night, and a presence that seemed to pull the lights toward her. She wore no jewelry, no brand that shouted. Instead, she had the look of someone who moved quickly and didn't care for the small attention of others. She paused where Grace sat, and then, with a quick, polite smile, asked if the seat by the window was taken. Grace's hand hovered over the pocket where the letter rested, and something in her wanted to say yes. Yes to the seat, yes to keeping the paper close, yes to the illusion that order could remain. But the woman's face was tired in the particular way of people carrying history in their eyes. Occupied, Grace said, voice small but steady. The woman nodded and moved on. She settled in a few rows back, and the flight hummed forward in a rhythm of closed windows and the folding of trays. The letter seemed suddenly louder in Grace's mind, as if the words had turned into the sound of rain on a roof. The plane taxied, then stopped at the edge of that gray place where motion becomes a possibility. Grace pressed her palm against the window and watched the night compress into the pinprick of the runway. She thought of the meridian, of rooms with curtains that held secrets, and of a night she had tried to forget. Memory does strange things. It will either fade like a photograph left in the sun or sharpen into dangerous clarity when someone mentions a name. Tonight, one sentence in a scrap of paper had sharpened everything. The flight attendant announced that, for reasons outside their control, passengers would have to remain seated for a short while. Grace clenched the letter in her pocket as if it were a talisman. Somewhere, under the hum and the polite murmurs, a new feeling threaded through her, a prickling, like the first trace of a fever. She could not tell yet whether it was fear or something like the sudden bright certainty you get before you act. Outside, the runway lights blinked on. Inside, the plane held its breath. Grace folded herself tighter into her seat, and the world shrank to the size of her palm and the single line that read, "We know what you did at the Meridian." The announcement came just as Grace began to calm her breathing. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a minor system delay. Shouldn't be long." The tone was practiced, reassuring, yet there was a hesitation tucked inside the sentence, like a note played half a second too late. Grace noticed it. She always noticed things that didn't quite fit. Her instincts, sharpened by boardroom battles and broken promises, registered the discomfort before her logic caught up. The hum of the engines dulled, and the cabin lights flickered once, twice, then steadied into an artificial twilight. Across the aisle, the same white man who had smiled at her earlier, tall, self-assured, name stitched in neat letters on a monogrammed briefcase, David C. Hale, shifted in his seat. He pressed the call button and leaned back with a sigh that carried entitlement-like perfume. Grace didn't look directly at him, but she felt the invisible line of tension forming. The flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and a too-tight bun, hurried over. "Yes, sir." "I think there's been a mistake," David said smoothly, pointing toward Grace's seat. "This is 2A. My seat." Grace froze. She blinked, the words registering a few beats late. "Excuse me." David smiled, the kind of smile people use when they think the problem is temporary and easily solved by their own importance. "I believe you're in my seat. First class 2A. It's printed right here." He lifted his ticket between two fingers as though the thin piece of paper was a decree from heaven. Grace pulled her boarding pass from her purse, her pulse beginning to quicken. 2A, she said calmly, showing her own. For a moment, both papers hovered in the air, identical numbers printed in bold. The attendant's eyes darted between them, confusion softening her features. She pressed her earpiece and murmured into her mic, "Carla, can you confirm a duplicate boarding pass?" "Seat 2A." Grace could hear faint static in return, then silence. David chuckled under his breath. "Must be a system glitch. Happens sometimes. But I've had this seat booked for weeks. Corporate upgrade, you know how it is?" Grace's lips parted to reply, but something about his tone stopped her. The casual condescension, the unspoken assumption that her presence here must be a mistake, it wasn't new. She had heard it before in conference rooms, in hushed interviews where her brilliance was praised but her legitimacy quietly questioned. Still, it shouldn't sting anymore. Yet it did. The attendant cleared her throat. "Ma'am, would you mind, just for a moment, standing while we check?" There was a pause, a long, electric pause that felt heavier than the recycled air around them. Grace could sense eyes turning toward her from other seats, curiosity disguised as politeness. Her heartbeat began to echo in her ears. "I've already stored my things," Grace said evenly. "You can check from here." David leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Come on, sweetheart, don't make this difficult. You can take 3B, still first class. I'm sure it's comfortable enough." The words landed like a slap. Grace's jaw clenched. "Don't call me sweetheart." The attendant's face shifted with discomfort. "Sir, please lower your voice." David's confidence only grew in the friction. "I'm not trying to start a scene. I just want my seat." But a scene was already unfolding. The passengers' chatter had softened into a collective hush. The baby that had cried earlier was quiet now, replaced by the sound of shuffling feet and soft murmurs. Grace inhaled slowly, her nails pressing half-moons into her palm. "I'm not moving. This is my seat." David's smirk faltered. "Is this really worth?" Before he could finish, the attendant's earpiece crackled to life. "Ground control just confirmed the duplicate boarding pass. Looks like a system error from check-in. Please keep both passengers seated until it's resolved." But there was only one seat, and in that suspended moment, something inside Grace shifted. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about every boardroom she'd walked into as the only black woman, every time she'd been asked if she was in the right meeting, every half-compliment wrapped in doubt. This wasn't about one man or one flight. It was about power. David didn't move either. His voice dropped lower, quieter but colder. "You know, people like you think money makes you untouchable." Grace's eyes flicked toward him, narrowing. "People like me?" He leaned back, a faint smile curling at the edge of his mouth. The kind who thinks success erases where they came from. But it never does. For a split second, Grace couldn't breathe. The words weren't loud, but they struck with precision. She wondered what he knew, or thought he knew. Then came the second announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize, but due to a technical concern, we'll be returning to the gate. Please remain seated." A low groan rippled through the cabin. Grace exhaled, her pulse still erratic. The flight attendant apologized softly again, eyes flicking nervously between her and David. Grace looked down at her handbag. The letter inside felt heavier now, as though the ink itself was watching. "We know what you did at the Meridian." The coincidence was too sharp. She had received that letter only hours before boarding. Now, a man she had never met was speaking to her as if he knew something personal. And the sudden system error, The plane being grounded minutes after the confrontation, it all felt too neatly timed. The attendant excused herself to check with the captain, but Grace could feel the shift in air. The hum of idle engines mixed with whispers. A man 2 rows ahead turned halfway in his seat, pretending to stretch, but clearly eavesdropping. Grace caught his reflection in the dark window, an earpiece tucked under his collar. Her gut twisted. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. David was watching her now, expression unreadable. "Rough night, huh?" he said lightly. Grace didn't answer. She stared out the window, where airport vehicles moved like slow insects under white floodlights. Beyond them, the city glowed distant and detached, its lights indifferent to human tension. Then her phone buzzed again. No caller ID. One new text. She hesitated before unlocking it. "You shouldn't have come on this flight." Her throat tightened. She turned the screen toward the window, the blue glow cutting against her face. Her reflection looked like a stranger, poised, powerful, and terrified. Grace's gaze darted toward the aisle. The man 2 rows ahead had turned back around, but she could see him subtly adjust something in his lap, a small black device, almost like a recorder. Her pulse raced. She slipped her phone into her bag and forced her expression to smooth. "Who sent this?" she whispered to herself, but the question was swallowed by the low hum of the grounded jet. A faint clatter of metal echoed from the galley, followed by the muffled voice of a crew member. The sound was ordinary, yet Grace flinched like it was thunder. She caught David watching her again, this time not with arrogance, but something colder, interest. "You look nervous," he said softly. "Do I?" He smiled faintly. Everyone gets nervous when they're caught off guard. The phrase lingered like smoke. Grace turned back to the window, her reflection flickering in the dim cabin light. Somewhere deep inside her, an old instinct, the one that had built her empire from nothing, whispered that this wasn't random. Someone had planned this. Someone had wanted her on this plane. In this moment, surrounded, unguarded, and someone, perhaps the man sitting across from her, knew exactly what had happened at the Meridian. Outside, the rain began to fall, faint and rhythmic against the fuselage. The lights on the tarmac blinked like quiet warnings. Grace didn't move, didn't speak. But beneath her calm exterior, a silent decision began to form. Readiness to uncover who had orchestrated this night and why the truth she buried years ago was clawing its way back to the surface. The flight was grounded, but Grace knew that before this plane ever left the runway, something far more dangerous was already in motion. Grace watched the cabin breathe around her and tried to map the people into stories. It was how she made sense of the world, by turning faces into patterns, motives into equations. David Hale was a simple variable. Loud confidence, sharp suit, a smell of expensive cologne that left a fine dust on everything near him. He spoke like a man who had never been refused, and the way he aimed that smile at her told her what he expected. Retreat. Carla, the attendant, hovered like someone who preferred the neatness of rules to the mess of people. She kept apologizing to both of them with a voice that trembled at the edges. "I'm so sorry, sir. Ma'am, please stay seated." She had the look of someone who had learned to hold small disasters together with polite phrases. Her binder sat on her hip like a shield. Grace guessed Carla had been a flight attendant for years. There was a steadiness in her that felt quietly brave. Behind them, a man named Evan, tall, narrow-shouldered, his hair darker at the roots, kept turning his head as if the cabin were a room where he couldn't find the right painting. He'd smiled at Grace once earlier with something like recognition, but then he looked away fast, like someone who had seen the wrong thing by accident. Grace felt him notice the letter in her bag when she shifted. He didn't ask. He just walked. She didn't like that she could not read him. A few rows forward, the woman who had chosen a seat a few rows back, Rachel, moved her hand to her throat and smoothed her scarf in a restless, almost ritual way. Rachel's face carried a different kind of tiredness, more weathered, softer, as if life had pressed on her and left a careful patience. She'd walked down the aisle with the purposeful step of someone used to moving through other people without asking permission. When she passed Grace, Their eyes had flicked and something small had passed. An exchange that was neither warmth nor hostility, but knowledge. Two women who had learned to keep their defenses up. Grace thought of her own room at home, of the photograph on her mantel, a younger Grace with Thomas Wright, laughing beneath a summer sky. Thomas had been a partner long ago, a man whose loyalty had once felt like a contract written in stone. He had walked away years before, taking half the company and leaving words that tasted like betrayal. People who had known Thomas asked after him as if they missed him. People who had never met him pointed at Grace with small admiration. She had used his absence to build steel. But the letter, "We know what you did at the Meridian," had names folded inside it she hadn't seen for a long time. Grace's mind kept circling back to Thomas because his face fit certain blanks. Ambition, a temper she once loved, a capacity to hurt. David shifted in his seat again, studying her with something like interest. "You run a company, right?" he asked, as if the question were charity. The way he said it folded layers: curiosity, disdain, the faint hope he might earn a story later. Grace could have lied. She could have said nothing. But she answered simply, because answers kept the world honest in small ways. "Yes," she said, "a delivery network." The words tasted like burnt toast. Her life was always condensed into neat phrases for people who wanted the highlight reel. David leaned back, an eyebrow lifted. "Must be nice. People like that get special treatment." He glanced at Carla, then back at her. "I mean, upgrades, invites, the whole parade. You look impressed by all that, don't you?" Grace let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. "I've had my share of both," she said, "but I prefer earning things to being gifted them." The exchange landed with an awkwardness that made Evan shift in his seat again. Rachel watched, and something flickered across her face, sympathy, perhaps, or memory. People watching do something strange. They put themselves into other people's lives like a test and see if there's a fit. Grace could tell that both Rachel and Evan had started that quiet game, and she didn't like the way it left them exposed. Carla returned with an iPad in hand. "Ground control says it's a software issue," she said. "They're resolving it, but it may be a while." She smiled that small, professional smile. "We'll keep you updated." People sank differently into their seats. The cabin took on more of a domestic hush, muted conversations, the rustle of newspapers, the soft clink of a cup on a tray. In that softer light, Grace watched faces more carefully. She found herself cataloging who might help, who might harm, who might take delight at her discomfort. It felt cruel that part of her business mind never slept. It had learned to value people by the leverage they held. Evan's knuckles whitened again, and this time Grace saw more: a scrap of a badge tucked into his wallet, the letters partially visible, INV. He had the anxious precision of someone who watched others for a living. A private investigator? A security specialist? Both roles defined themselves by the ways they picked through small details. Grace's heart thumped with a new rhythm. If he was on the plane to watch her, why had he come? For protection? For blackmail? For curiosity? Rachel, meanwhile, had pulled a paperback from her bag and pretended to read, though her eyes kept catching Grace's profile. When their gazes met, Rachel gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. It was a nod that said, "I saw you." It also said, "I know what it's like to be measured." Grace remembered a dinner from years ago where a philanthropist had said to her, "You're very brave for a young black woman in tech." The phrase had been well meant, but it had felt like a door slammed closed. Brave wasn't a title she wore proudly. It was a status others put on you when they had no real power to act. Now, with the letter and the grounding, bravery felt less like a compliment and more like a necessity. David tried another jab. "So, Grace," he said, using her name like he had the right, "what happens when your past catches up with you?" The sentence was small, but it struck like a stone thrown at glass. Grace's mouth went dry. "Depends on who throws it," she said. David's smile thinned. "Don't be dramatic." Carla cleared her throat, stepping between them with the posture of someone who wanted to be invisible and kept being forced into the scene. "Sir, please. We can't have disturbances." Evan's eyes flicked to David, then to Grace, then to the pocket where her letter sat. For a long moment, silence wrapped the four of them, a businessman, a founder, an attendant, and a man with an investigator's hands. Each of them carried motives the others couldn't fully read. Grace let the silence stretch. Inside, she ran small simulations. If Evan was an investigator, who had hired him? If Rachel was sympathetic, was it because she saw a reflection of her own trouble? If David knew more than he let on, what had he been told? The cabin allowed these questions to hang like dust motes. Outside, rain blurred the lights. Inside, each person steadied themselves in the soft hum. Grace felt the ledger of her life add a new line. Tonight, someone had decided to test her. Whether they meant to unmake her or save her, she could not tell yet. What she felt sure of was this: alliances would show themselves by action, not by words. And in a room full of strangers, the smallest actions would reveal everything. For a long moment, the cabin held its breath, every small sound magnified. The rustle of a napkin, the distant thump of a cart, the tiny metallic click of a hinge. Grace felt the world narrow to the slice of light over her hand, to the letter in her bag and the thud of her pulse in her throat. Then Evan slid from his seat before anyone could move, and the hush stretched taut, like a wire. He did not go to the crew or to the captain. He walked straight to Grace, each step measured, as if he had rehearsed this in 1,000 rooms. When he reached her, he did not look like an intruder. He looked like someone who had been given permission to speak. "Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly, showing a badge for only a heartbeat. Investigations, the letters half hidden, then tucking it back. "May I speak with you? Privately?" Grace's mouth had gone dry. "Why?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, Evan held out a slim envelope, one of those paper things the world used when legal proof wanted to hide in plain sight. He placed it in her lap and stepped back. The movement was calm, almost courteous, but the air around him was charged. Inside, folded like a small, secret bird, was a photograph. Grace's fingers trembled when she unfolded it. For a second, the image made no sense. An angle, a flash of silk, the curve of a shoulder. Then her brain fitted the pieces together, and the world tilted. There she was, younger but unmistakable. Grace, hairpin back, laughing in a dim hotel suite. Beside her, half obscured, was Thomas. In the corner of the photograph, cropped so that it was almost a footnote, was another figure, someone whose face she had spent years trying to forget. The photograph had been taken at the Meridian. Her throat closed. The name she did not say, Marta, hovered in the air like an accusation. Marta had been the one who'd left drunk and alone that night, the one whose absence had rippled into consequences Grace had never fully accounted for. Grace had told herself for years that accident happened. She had told herself she had done what she needed to keep the company alive. She had told herself the ledger of moral compromises was balanced by the good she tried to do. But photographs do a cruel thing. They are indisputable. "Where did you get this?" Grace asked, voice small, brittle. Evan's eyes held nothing but a neutral, professional calm. "Collected evidence," he said, "from someone who thought you should see it directly." David, who had been watching with a predator's patience, leaned forward. "Interesting, isn't it? You built an empire on a foundation no one would forgive if they knew." His words were soft as they landed, as if he were offering a benediction. The cabin felt colder. A dozen tiny betrayals folded themselves into Grace's chest at once. Memories of Thomas's easy charm, of a late-night meeting where a decision had been made and a door had been closed. For years, she had carried a private calculus. Protect the company, protect the people who depended on it. It had seemed necessary then. Necessity is a shapeshifter. You give a name and it becomes justification. Evan's hand, small and steady, revealed another thing, a small recorder. He pressed play. The cabin filled with a voice that was unmistakable. Thomas's clipped, arguing about options, about managing the fallout. Another voice, Marta's, panicked and sharp, overlapped, begging. The recording cut, then restarted on a fragment no one could deny. Grace's voice, younger and harder, promising, "I'll handle it. Just keep it quiet. We can fix this." Sound has a way of being final. The drone of the engine seemed to lower its volume as the playback kept rolling. Around them, people leaned forward like flowers toward light. Rachel's paperback slipped closed. Carla's face had gone very pale. A betrayal like this is not a single knife, it's a series of small cuts. Grace felt each one. She had told herself that her choices were constrained by the geometry of survival, by the edges of leases and payroll, by the men who wanted to take everything if she showed weakness. But the recording rewrote the ledger in an instant. The secret was no longer private. Someone had curated it into proof, and then placed that proof into her hands, on a plane, surrounded by strangers. You had this? You built this? Grace's voice trembled with something that was close to anger and closer to grief. Who gave it to you? Evan folded his hands like a man closing a case file. I was contracted to compile material about the Meridian incident, he said. Sources, documents, audio, photographs. The client made it clear he wanted leverage. And who is your client? Grace demanded. David laughed, but it was hollow. He looked around the cabin for a moment, as if he were choosing which person would be the pawn to roll next. You don't need to be coy, Evan, he said. You were hired by a familiar name. We're all old enough to know how these things get arranged. Grace felt something cold and precise settle on her like a stone. Her mind reached for Thomas, for the years of quiet erosion since he had left. A flash of memory, Thomas in the doorway, suitcase in hand, his eyes saying he needed something he wouldn't name, flared and went out. She had assumed his departure was the kind of betrayal that comes with flesh and failing promises. She had never imagined he would return as an architect of her destruction. But Evan's next words were worse and quieter than anything before. Our client wanted to make sure you can be controlled. So he did what needed to be done. He set a situation where you'd be exposed. He bought seats, contracted a tech for the recording, and arranged for you to receive that letter. Tonight was planned. The cabin blurred. The rain on the fuselage became an avalanche of sound. Grace's hands shook so badly, she nearly dropped the photograph back into the envelope. A betrayal that had felt abstract, someone speaking ill, was given a face, a timetable, a plan. Someone had not only dug up her past, they had choreographed the present. David's tone softened in that performative way of men used to having doors open for them. So, Ms. Mitchell, what will you do? Confess? Deny? Or will you make a deal? The words were more than a request, they were a hinge. Around her, the people on the plane began to occupy themselves with other small comforts. A laugh here, the flip of a magazine there. But Grace felt the air shrinking around her. The photograph, the recording, the note, each piece of evidence worked like a magnet for the rest of her life. This was no longer just about the seat. The ground beneath her, reputation, agency, all the careful scaffolding of her life, was suddenly in question. The thread out in the dark had name. It had hands and plans and money. The betrayal was double. Thomas had left her, and now he had the power to shape her fall. A quiet burned behind Grace's eyes. She thought of the ledger again, the list of compromises she had made. She thought of Marta, of a night that had been stitched into stories and then hidden under the weight of contracts. Her breath came in small controlled pulls. She could choose to crumble, to plead ignorance, to try and make the recording less than it was. Or she could let the anger that had always made her dangerous rise and see who else would move when she stopped being predictable. Evan tucked his recorder away without ceremony. David folded his arms like a man settling into the next move of the game he expected to win. The passengers resumed their small rituals, unaware or unwilling to watch the slow unspooling of a life. Grace pressed the photograph against her palm until the edges bit. The betrayal that had once been a rumor in her mind now sat solidly before her. It had been orchestrated, personal, and precise. The path forward was unclear, but clarity had a way of sharpening resolve. She slid the photo back into the envelope and met David's eyes with something that had nothing of apology in it. If this is a game to you, she said slowly, you picked the wrong player. His smile was a thin line. We'll see. The cabin tightened around Grace like a noose made of polite whispers. After the photograph and the recording, normal sounds felt obscene. The clink of a cup, the rustle of pages, even the distant laugh that someone tried to make sound casual. Grace kept her face still, but inside everything was moving fast. Her mind cataloged options as if she were in a meeting. Deny, confess, stall for time, make a public statement, bring legal counsel in, call her board. Each choice had a cost measured in trust money and lives, people who relied on the payroll she signed every month. The ledger of consequences opened, and the columns multiplied. Evan sat back in his seat, a quiet island of neutrality. David watched her with thin, impatient interest, like a man watching a clock tick toward a jackpot. Carla moved up and down the aisle, her smile tighter, checking on passengers who now looked at one another with a small suspicion of people locked in. Rachel folded her hands, the paperback abandoned on her lap, eyes soft and sad as if she held memory instead of words. Grace slid her phone from her bag and stared at the dark screen. Her assistant's message sat like a live wire. "Where are you? Are you okay? The board wants an update." She could send a calm reply, delay due to technical issues, or a frank one that would start a chain reaction she could not control. If she told them about the photograph and the recording, the company's lawyers would react immediately. The press would smell blood. If she lied, she would be building a fragile dam that might burst later. She thought of Marta. She thought of Thomas. The shapes of the past pressed in on her like humidity. The decision was not only about her, it was about the people who had trusted her when she needed them most. Release the truth and risk destroying a business that employed hundreds. Conceal it and live under the threat of exposure. Both paths tasted like metal. She opened her messages and typed a sentence, then deleted it. The cabin's low murmur felt like the world's tide, and she was a small boat close to jagged rocks. Her hands trembled. She tried to steady them by focusing on the hum under her skin, the steady beating that had always been her metronome. She breathed slowly. Think like a CEO, she told herself. Break down the problem. Prioritize stakeholders. A soft knock at the front of the cabin made everyone look up. Two men in suits boarded, badges glinting faintly, airport security, their expressions polite, but blank. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "We've had a report that requires a routine check. Please remain seated." Routine. The word felt absurd. One of the men walked down the aisle, eyes flicking over faces. He paused at their row, the briefcase he carried heavy and official. "Ms. Mitchell," he asked, voice low but formal. Grace's throat felt raw. "Yes. Would you come with us for a short conversation? Nothing punitive. Just to clarify some information." The polite veneer of the request barely hid the implication. A conversation with men who wore suits and badges could become a record. Grace stood, the small of her back aching. Her body moved before she thought, because in her bones was the training of someone who met trouble head-on. The photograph and the recording could be explained, or at least contained. That was easier to believe than the alternative. David's lips flattened. "I'll come too," he said. His tone suggested he would enjoy the show. Evan rose slowly, hands open, the posture of a man who would not be accused of theatrics. Rachel watched them go, eyes distant. In the corridor, fluorescent lights hummed like a hospital. The security officers led them to a small room just off the jetway where the noise of the plane became a dull roar. A table for chairs, a glass of water, sterile and small. The officers closed the door and took seats, their badges placed deliberately on the table, as if to remind everyone of the rules. "Ms. Mitchell," one said, "we're investigating a complaint related to a photo and audio recording. We need to confirm your identity and then ask a few questions." Grace felt the room tilt. "I'll cooperate," she said. "I want this cleared up." The man with the badge glanced at David, then at Evan. "You two were involved in the incident we're querying?" David's smile was cold. "I happened to be present," he said. "I raised the issue. Ms. Mitchell, there are questions about how the company handled an incident years ago. We thought it best to bring it to light." Evan offered nothing but a quiet nod. The officers asked questions that sounded like a script and felt like a verdict. What happened at the Meridian? Who was present? What actions were taken? Grace answered with care, the edges of her memory smoothed by time and defense. She tried to shape the truth so it would fit into a narrative that would be accepted. Lawyers taught you to carve words like knife edges, sharp enough to protect, blunt enough not to cut yourself further. After the interview, the officers left them waiting. Grace's pulse was a drum. She thought of calling Thomas, of confronting him, but his number was a fissure she did not want to touch. He had left, and with him had gone the easy edges of anger. She swallowed the urge to call her lawyer instead. On flights, calls could be overheard. She felt trapped between the need for counsel and the immediacy of the moment. Back on the plane, they were asked to return to their seats. Passengers watched them file in, the murmurs now edged with new detail. A man across the aisle whispered to his companion, loud enough for Grace to hear, "Did you hear? Something about a photo." Another passenger tapped a feed on his tablet, and his eyes widened. Someone had already started typing. Grace slid into her seat as cameras of attention trained on her. The cabin felt like a courtroom, and she was both defendant and accused. The recording and the photograph had already become a public object in the soft way that gossip turns private things into common currency. Someone in the cabin was a bridge between them and the outside world. She imagined headlines with her name, accusations without context, the court of public opinion hungry for simple shapes. The fear was not the shame itself. It was the way shame could erase nuance, flattening out choices into black letters that swallowed explanation. Her phone buzzed again. "Board, are you under control? PR needs a line." She typed, delayed on return to gate. No further details. She sent it because she had to buy time. Time was a fragile currency tonight. The officers could file something. David could speak to anyone who would listen. Evan could hand over a dossier. The letter's anonymous signature still sat, underlined in her head like a promise. "We know what you did at the Meridian." When the plane finally promised to return to the gate, the cabin stirred like a field in a draft. Grace watched the lights blur, her thoughts a spool, unwinding. She knew one thing with the hard clarity of someone who had built and burned and built again. She needed to act, and she needed to choose carefully. Every move now would be measured and recorded. Her choices were moral and practical, tangled like ropes. Confess and risk destroying the company and hurting the people who trusted her. Deny and risk becoming the author of a lie that could be unspooled at any time. Fight and make enemies worse. Withdraw and live with shame like a silent companion. She closed her eyes for a second and let the hum of the plane fill her ears. The ledger of consequences lay open. She had always prided herself on being the author of her life. Tonight, someone else had started writing in the margins. Grace opened her eyes and, with a slow breath that tasted of metal and rain, decided to stop being merely reactive. She would gather facts. She would call counsel. She would reach out to one person she trusted blindly. Then she would decide. But even as she formed that plan, a new message came through. No name, no number, only 3 words. "Don't trust Evan." The rain on the tarmac looked like 1,000 silver threads, each one catching the floodlight and turning it to a blade. The jetway hissed as it coughed passengers back into the wet night, and the fluorescent lights made everyone's faces pale and flat. Cameras blinked nearby. Phones held like small altars, and clusters of airport staff and a few impatient reporters gathered under umbrellas. The grounded plane had become a stage. Grace walked out first, the photograph folded inside her palm like a confession and a tool at once. Her shoes made small, sure sounds against the metal ramp. People parted without meaning to. They sensed the quiet she carried, an authority that was not only money but consequence. David followed a few paces behind, his coat damp, his jaw set in that tight line of men who never liked getting soaked by surprise. Evan walked beside him, hands shoved in his pockets as if trying to look casual. Rachel, no, Marta, stayed a step behind, the wet hem of her coat clinging to her calves, her eyes steady on Grace as if measuring where to land a blow. They stood beneath the airport lights. A police sergeant held a small notebook and watched like someone who wanted to make sure nothing worse happened than words. For a long breath, there was only the sound of rain and the distant rush of traffic. "Ms. Mitchell," the sergeant said politely, "we asked you to step aside to answer a few more questions." Grace looked at him and then at the crowd and shook her head once, a small, clear movement. "Not here," she said. Her voice was the kind that made people listen, soft but threaded with steel. "If this is going to be public, let it be public." David smiled as if the night had finally given him a gift. "Before we make this messy," he said, stepping forward, "let's get some clarity. People deserve the truth." He looked at the assembled phones and then at Grace. "You hid things, Ms. Mitchell. You need to explain." A murmur rose, hungry and low. Someone shouted a question about resignations. A camera brightened. Grace unfolded the photo slowly and raised it so that the nearest lenses could catch the image. The movement made the rain catch the light. She could feel the ledger of her life shifting in the public air, pages turning where no one could control them. "Years ago," she said, voice steady, "I made a choice. I covered a night that should have been handled differently. I'm not proud of it. I have apologized in private and tried to make amends where I could." The words fell like stones into the puddle of sound. People listened for the splash. Then Marta stepped forward. She had been quiet up until now, face composed but raw in a way that made everyone flip their private scripts. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of weight that comes from being the thing people talk about. "You apologized," she said, "to people who matter to you, not to me." The truth of that sentence landed harder than anything else. Cameras leaned in. Marta's hands trembled a fraction. Her fingers curled around the strap of her bag. Grace's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she said again, and this time the apology had open ribs. It was messy and human, and not meant to absolve. "I know sorry doesn't fix everything." Thomas's boots squeaked as he came down the ramp, late and deliberate. He wore a heavy coat and a face that had been practiced for betrayal. The crowd parted like reeds around something poisonous. When he stopped a few feet away, his eyes were bright, not with remorse, but with the cold light of reckoning. "You should be," he said quietly, "you should be very sorry, Grace." He looked at Marta with something like contempt. "And you," he said, turning, "you should have stayed out of it." The world bristled. David stepped closer to Thomas like two wolves closing ranks. Thomas was only trying to help bring the truth out, David announced, his voice too smooth. "It's time for accountability." Evan's jaw worked in a small, nervous tick. For a second, Grace thought the warning message, "Don't trust Evan," had been right all along. Then Evan pulled something from his pocket, a small hard drive. He held it out with a hand that shook. "Play this," he said, looking at David and Thomas both. "If you want the full truth." Thomas laughed, thin and brittle. "You were paid to compile, dirt." "Evan," he said, "you were paid to manipulate." "Maybe I was," Evan replied. "Maybe I was paid to do ugly things. But I also recorded things you didn't expect to be recorded." He turned the drive toward Grace and then toward the nearest police officer. "Public record now." A technician nearby connected the drive to a small monitor. The first image that flashed up was a grainy video. Thomas in a dark office, leaning across a table toward David, both of them speaking low, their faces close. The audio buzzed at first and then cleared into phrases that took the air out of people's lungs. "If she goes down," Thomas said on the recording, "we take the pieces. We buy the shares when they drop, David. We buy control cheap. No one will plead for her." "And Marta?" David asked on the tape, voice casual. "People forget names," Thomas replied. "They forget victims when there's money to be made." The screen cut to another clip, Evan's voice now speaking with a different cadence, orchestrating the planted letter, arranging seating, coordinating a tech to capture other conversations. The camera panned back to show charts and calendars and emails in which Thomas signed off. The plot was tight and clinical. It had the smell of a plan made with competence and cruelty. The crowd's murmur rose to a shout. David's face lost the last of its composure. He stepped back the way someone steps away from a cliff. Thomas's expression hardened. "You're showing edits," he hissed. You're fabricating context. Evan shrugged. You told me what you wanted. He looked at Grace. Then I listened, and I recorded more. Suddenly, Marta moved. She didn't speak to the cameras. She walked to Thomas and stood so close that everyone could see the small rag of a scar along her jaw, the shadow under her eye. Her voice broke, but she held it steady. You used me, she said. You said you'd help. You said you'd protect me if I disappeared. You sold my silence to your partners like I was a thing. Her hands found Grace's, as if pulling a lifeline. I thought you were protecting me, Grace. I thought you were the one in charge. Her eyes flooded open then, and for a moment, the rain looked like it came from every sympathetic lens. Grace had nothing to shield herself with anymore. She looked at Thomas and at David and then at Marta. The apology that dripped out of her was raw and real. I failed you, she said. I made a call I thought would keep people safe. It cost us both. I can't take back what happened. I can only try to fix it going forward. Thomas, furious, tried to salvage control. This is a smear. They're twisting things, he said, but his voice lacked traction. The evidence on the screen and Marta's presence were anchors in the storm. Then Evan did something no one expected. He stepped forward and spoke directly to the cameras in a voice that was almost a dare. I was hired, he said, but I didn't sell the story to the highest bidder. I kept copies. I gave them to Ms. Mitchell and to the authorities. I exposed the plan because some things aren't worth money. He looked at Thomas with a look that carried both pity and contempt. You thought you could own people's silence. You were wrong. David's shoulders slumped as if a long-held posture could no longer be maintained. He opened his mouth, but no words came that could hold back what was coming. Thomas's face went dry and old in one breath. The arrogance that had been his armor had been cut into small, useless plates. The sergeant stepped forward, reading words from a small paper, like a funeral rite. Mr. Hale, Mr. Wright, you are under investigation. The phrasing was formal, but the import was blunt. The powerful could be questioned. In the wet light, Grace felt the ledger close and open at once. She had confessed to a moral failure and been forced into public reckoning, but the larger conspiracy that would have destroyed more than her reputation was stopped, at least for now. Marta looked at her with something like wary hope, and for the first time since the letter had arrived, Grace felt the rawness of possibility. She turned to the cameras and then to the small crowd of passengers whose faces had been part of this night. I will make this right, she said, not to justify, but to promise. To Marta, to everyone harmed by what we did to hide pain for profit, I will not let you be anonymous anymore. People around them exhaled in different ways. Relief, anger, the tired satisfaction of a public drama that had meaning. The rain slowed to a hush, and the floodlights softened as if the world were allowing breath to return. As officers led Thomas and David away, Evan remained by Grace's side. She didn't know what his future held. Loyalty is a thin and complicated thing, but he had chosen a line in the sand. Marta took Grace's hand, and their fingers fit like two halves of something broken. Grace felt the ledger weigh differently now. Consequences would come. Legal, financial, personal. She had stepped into the light with her fault exposed, and in doing so she had found a sliver of something like redemption. It would not erase the past, but it might change the direction of what came next. The airport clock blinked wet and indifferent. Grace let the tears that had been held for hours fall. They tasted like rain and relief and the hard metal of a life rebuilt from its own ruins. The days after the rain felt slow and loud, as if the world around Grace had been turned up a notch, so every small sound counted. News vans came and went, lawyers circled politely, and then with sharper teeth, and the boardroom that had once felt like a second home turned into a place where faces were polite and hands measured. The company weathered immediate shocks, stock dips, tough questions from reporters, but the people who showed up every day to make deliveries and answer support calls kept doing their job. That steadiness steadied Grace more than any legal brief could have. Marta began to attend meetings with a guarded calm, sitting near the back and watching the same room where she had once been invisible. She met privately with Grace more than once. At first, their conversations were small and brittle, held together with practicalities, arrangements for therapy, compensation, and the gentle, necessary work of reconnecting a life that had been washed away. Later, their talks carried things that sounded like trust in the thin way trust can be built after truth. Marta did not forgive on a schedule. She did not forget. She wanted to be seen and safe, and that demand reshaped Grace's days. Thomas and David were under formal investigation. Grace watched from a distance as subpoenas and depositions unfolded. There were nights she lay awake replaying the recordings, searching for the precise moment her choices became culpable. She had once believed power could be used as a shield for the people she loved. Now she saw that power can be a blunt instrument, and that protection can easily become harm. The ledger she kept in her head had entries rewritten, some black, some red, but the weight of numbers shifted into a harder kind of accounting: who had been hurt and by how much. Evan stayed. The choice surprised her at first. He had been paid for some of the work he did. He admitted it openly, with no shame in saying he had taken money for dirty tasks before. But he had also kept copies, had passed files to authorities, and when the cameras had been turned off, he had sat across from Grace and said blunt things that cut and healed in equal measure. "You don't get to be a saint out of greed," he told her once over coffee. "But you can still choose to stop the harm." The sentence lodged in her like a splinter, painful, but necessary to remove. There were legal consequences, of course. Grace stepped down from an executive position she had once loved. She kept a seat on the board but insisted on new oversight, new ethics rules, and a fund that paid for victims' care. The decision cost her public standing and comfort. It also opened space for something she had not allowed before: humility. She learned to say fewer polished sentences and more true ones. That shift did not erase what had been done, but it began to redirect her power. The company, under new counsel and with a reshaped leadership team, began to work in ways that made people listen more than they had before. Employees who had once been unseen were asked to sit on advisory panels. Marta's story became a reason to change policy rather than a single news cycle. Grace used what influence she had left not to hide mistakes, but to fund programs that helped people like Marta, survivors, workers, those who had been sidelined by profit. Owning the cost of harm became, for her, a daily practice rather than a press release. At night, she sat alone sometimes and opened the photograph from the Meridian, the one that had started the fall. It no longer had the same power to seize her throat. Instead, it had edges softened by consequence. She visited Marta's small apartment once, and they cooked a meal that burned slightly and tasted of promise. Marta laughed at the way Grace chopped onions like she was doing a financial model. It was an ordinary moment that felt huge. Two women sharing a cheap dinner, both carrying scars, both deciding together to keep moving. Grace thought often of the line Evan had said in the small quiet after the chaos: "You can still choose to stop the harm." Those words became a compass. They did not erase the nights where she had sat in a hotel room and made decisions in the name of survival. They did not excuse her from anger or grief, but they changed the shape of her days. She began to mentor young founders honestly, warning them that shortcuts rot the center of any business. She insisted on transparency in the parts of the company she could affect. She learned how to listen. Forgiveness arrived in small, private ways. Marta did not sign statements that made Grace into a hero. She signed papers that allowed her to live with less fear. Thomas lost partnerships and respect. His name slid from invitations and from the places it once carried weight. David's reputation crumbled under scrutiny. Public judgments were messy, sometimes unfair, but they also made room for a different truth: that consequences can be real and restorative when they are paired with sincere attempts to repair. Grace's transformation was not a dramatic metamorphosis. She did not grow a halo. She lost things she loved, status, parts of a company she had built alone, but she gained other things: clarity, fewer illusions, and a new kind of courage that didn't demand applause. She learned that power's truest test is not whether you can shield yourself, but whether you can use what you have to right what you've broken. On a pale spring morning months later, Grace stood in front of a small audience at a community center, Marta in the third row, and Evan at the edge of the crowd. She spoke with a voice that had lost its polished distance and gained weight. I was wrong, she said plainly. I have been wrong. I used my power in ways that harmed people. I am sorry. I am trying to do better. The room stayed quiet, and that quiet felt like a place people could finally breathe. Afterwards, a woman came up and put her hand on Grace's arm. Thank you for not running away, she said. The words reached into a place that was still tender. Grace had always feared the small, honest things. A warm hand, a straightforward question, a demand for truth. Now they felt like the right kind of work. The moral of her story did not arrange itself into tidy lessons. It resisted slogans and sound bites. Instead, she learned to live inside the tension between power and responsibility, to admit that money and influence are tools that can build or break. The ledger would never be balanced perfectly. Some debts are paid and some remain open, but Grace found a new way to read the lines, one that kept the cost of hiding from becoming someone else's burden. At night, when the city lights shimmered like the runway had, she sometimes thought of the letter that had started it all, the small anonymous proof that had pulled her into the light. Once it had felt like a threat, now it felt like a call to live differently. She kept the photograph in a drawer, not hidden but not displayed, a reminder of what she had been capable of and, more importantly, what she had chosen to change. The story did not end with a neat apology and a clean slate. It ended with work, slow, awkward, and human. Grace had been stripped of some illusions and found the harder grace of responsibility. She had failed and then, by owning that failure, found a pathway toward repair. The cost was real. The result was quieter, a life redirected, and a promise kept in small, steady acts. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you'll enjoy. Have a great day.